Hello and welcome back to the Genesis Designs and Modelcraft bench, and in today's video we're going to talk a lot about strong wind. Hurricanes more precisely. So I have the Revell Hurricane here. It's a new 30-second scale kit, new tool, brand new. I got this from modelsforsale.com for the very reasonable price of £36.75. Now unfortunately he doesn't have any left. The RRP of the kit is £45.99, so that is a little bit of an increase on what we're used to for these type of kits from Revell. But having a quick look around the internet, you can pick one up for around about the £40 to £42 mark quite easily. So the kit itself then, standard shonky, unsturdy, cold opening box. This isn't the Genesis box review channel, but I really hate these end up opening boxes and I really wish they wouldn't do it. I wish nobody would do it, they're stupid. I'll have a quick look at the plastic parts first off. I haven't had these out of the bags yet. Let's see what we've got. This long slim one. We have fuselage halves and wing pieces. You can see that. Now, there's a bit of texture there straight away. A little bit. It's not excessive, but it's noticeable. Mould seam here running up, or a crinkle in the mould running up that panel there. The fabric texture, to my eye, looks nice. I know there's been a trend of late for fabric texture to be ecstatically overdone. I'm not a fan, and this is much more to my taste. So yeah, they look decent. Oh, and note, cowl fasteners that look actually like cowl fasteners and not that someone's got a donut fetish. Wing parts. So we've got one wing on each sprue here. Put those down. Recessed panel lines, again with that texture. I say it's not excessive, but it's there. And we've got raised detail here, raised rivets, raised fasteners, as well as recessed, which is nice. There's an aperture for the flaps, split flaps on the Hurricane. Some panel detail, more raised fasteners and rivets. I'm doing this all out of shot, no bed. And some recesses, but they don't go all the way through for the shell ejector ports. No detail of any kind on the insides. So I'll let you have a closer look. Raised details on that inboard section and where applicable actually, and the rest of it recessed. And it's really it's nice. It's kind of shallow, relatively crisp. It's decent, yeah. Turn my second light on. Better late than never. Alright, next up. Got two in the bag here, and some more airframe parts first. So, what's going to become a wheelbase / spar arrangement there? Flaps. Looks to me like an open set and a retracted set. Underside of the belly, so this is clearly for a sea hurricane. See the hook arrangement there? Centre wing, rudder, tower planes, ailerons and parts of the pilot's seat. So there must be another one of these on another sprue. Oh, so there is, it's on this one. Here we are. Belly without a hook. Got elevators here. We've got two different types of exhaust stubs, frameworks for the cockpit, some little quite clever little exhaust mounts that sort of slightly represent having a bit of Merlin in there. There's a firewall cowling, bits of cockpit, the rest of the seat, and the very, very front end of the cowl. There's machine gun inserts there, and these are all cockpit parts. As we might expect with Revell, there's some very untidy and ugly ejector pin and general mould fussiness, but most of it so far seems to be on the reverse of the parts, and that's fine, I can deal with that. Bad, not bad. Right then, the last main pack of pieces. Another two here, so let's do the little one first. Radiator, the housing and the bath. We've got your spinner here, beautiful one-piece spinner. Some really pretty pants looking cannon barrels, honestly. There's your leading edge inserts for the 2B with the extra machine guns. Centre leading edge area there, and I suspect that that's got to be part of a carburettor intake. I wonder if that's a desert intake, not really sure. And then on this one, undercarriage doors, got a propeller, a nice big meaty propeller. Wheels are in two parts each, but they then have a separate hub. Undercarriage legs and various bits of pipework and details. And again, it all looks pretty decent. There's little bits and pieces of flash and naughtiness, but it's not too bad. You see the flash around this propeller here, but it's not on the part, it's on the port area, so shouldn't be a problem. Lots of bits and pieces of structural detail and pipes and handles and levers, but it all looks quite nice. And then the final part, plastically speaking, is transparency. I have to say that looks really good. Really nice. The framing on these canopies is extremely subtle. Recessed, but very subtly done. Landing light covers, wingtip lights, and you've got a separate windscreen and canopy, so there's your closed option and your open option, and this part fits into the wheel well. A couple of small windows in it, but they do look very creditable indeed. Right, so that's the plastic parts, and I'm not lingering because I'm going to mech it. So then, instructions, etc. Let's slip that out of the way. Again, standard Revell fares, a built-up model on the front. Some how to use the instruction babble, colour call-outs in Revell paints as ever, and there's no cross-referencing with other colours with these. And then you've got your sprue layout diagrams, all numbered. Construction began with the cockpit, as usual. Yes, construction begins with the cockpit. Multi-part seat fitting together, and they've done this thing where they've got little slight hints of colour here and there to help you with the painting. And it carries on, and you end up with quite a nice looking framework representation of the internals of this Hurricane. Oh, it's still going. There's a lot going on here. We've even got tubing and pipe work for the engine. Some of the coolant pipes come down the side of the cockpit area here. I think there's decals for the instrument panel. Here's that cunning little partial sort of engine affair here. Gives you a solid mounting for the propeller and exhaust. And then we finally get the fuselage halves together. Then you go ahead and build the undercarriage bay, and you build that up onto that lower centre section part, before then joining all the wing parts to it. And looking at the wing parts with this kind of stubborn key affair, there's plenty of room there for that to be a pain in the butt, particularly if it's not moulded accurately. and with Revell being so exceptionally inconsistent in their moulding quality from kit to kit, and even across a kit, that could easily be an issue. Once you've got all that done, fit the fuselage to the wing and then complete the lower fuselage with those small panels. So as I said, we do have the parts in this kit to do a Sea Hurricane with that big air filter and the rear fuselage. So if you've got references to suit and you can sort decals, you can straight away build a Sea Hurricane out of this. Radiator going together, back end going on, and building the undercarriage. I like that the instruction book is too big. I like that the sort of raised area of the inside of the undercarriage door is a separate part, because more often than not when this is moulded as part of the door itself you end up with sink marks one side or the other, or both. So it's nice that those are separate. Then control surfaces going onto the wing, flaps can be lowered or not. We've got that choice of exhaust pipes, the sort of standard stubs, and then the fishtail kind. And we're finishing out with the step, the pitot, canopies and the prop. All very good, nice and clear. Painting options included are Hurricane IIB of number 79 Squadron, Royal Air Force, Fairwood Common, South Wales in July 41. Standard, dark earth, dark green over sky. Very, very standard indeed. And the second one is from 253 Squadron at Hibbled in late 41, and that's an overall black night fighter. So, lastly then, quick look at the decals themselves. Here we go. They have a good quality appearance, and I think Revell decals aren't too bad in use for the most part. We do have quite a nice instrument panel set there, and we've got stencil decals throughout, plus representations for the doped on patches that go over the machine gun ports. Not too bad. They're satin, they're not gloss, quite thin, and the carrier film's cut really, really close to the marking, which I personally think is a good thing. Now, for those of you that have done that thing where you read the video description before you come to the video, is there anyone who actually does that? I don't even do that. You'll have noted potentially that this is a bare naked build, and what I mean by that is I'm going to build this model. So I didn't see a reason for me to build this, because if I'd rather have a 2C, frankly, as I'm sure a lot of people would. I bought it simply to review it for the channel, but then I thought, well, as I've previously mentioned, Revell are gloriously inconsistent at times, so wouldn't it be nice to build it? I don't have time. Simply put, I don't have time to build this properly, so I decided I would build it in its entirety, not a quick snip, in effect a long snip. I'm going to build the whole kit but without any paint. So I'll build it in the normal way. I'll clean all the parts up properly and do everything, but I'll use liquid cement to join everything together, and we'll just see how it goes together, how it fits and how it looks when it's done. It will make for a slightly longer video, clearly, but I think it could be interesting. So without further ado, I will go ahead and start putting this thing together. Alrighty then, first two stages then. Make the seat and start making the part of the rear of the cockpit. Seats in 4 parts, and here they are, and straight away we're getting into Revell territory. Now you can see how intrusive those stubs are on that part, and it's not a huge part. And then on this is the seat back. It's got some nice detail on the back of it actually, but again quite intrusive stubs that kind of just blend onto the part a little bit more than you'd like, and will need sort of some careful trimming and sanding to get rid of them. And then note also that very unwanted texture on that seat back part. Yeah, and this is in two parts. If I just disassemble it now, already cleaned these up, and it was the usual thing, just that sort of slight unevenness around all of the edges, a lot of flash and rubbish along the bottom here, which I just sanded off. But straight away, a lot of part cleanup required. This part here, note, needs 2 1mm holes drilling, and these 2 holes here, which are nicely printed out for you, so it's nice and easy to do. I think I broke my last 1mm drill bit. Let's see. Need to get some more drills. No, I didn't. I've got one. Okay. 1mm drill. Just pop it into that hole that's already there for you. And it's obviously the part's thinner. And just drill it through. There we go, easy. So I'll clean up these sprue stubs. I'm going to do it with the camera running to show the way I deal with these things. It's not going to be the most exciting, but I think it's probably worth doing. So I'll zoom that down. I can't promise I'm going to stay in shot the whole time. I'm rubbish at that, I know. So let's start off by finding my sprue cutters. Here they are. I've got the nice fine Tamiya ones, and I start off by snipping that. Obviously I've snipped it very roughly initially, and that's so as to avoid damaging the part. So I'll snip it relatively close now. I can't go all the way because the curve of the part will get damaged, and this lower one I can't get in. I'd rather snip it this way, but I can't get in there, so I'll do it this way. There, that's got rid of those. Now I like to use a scalpel rather than sand, but I'll just take the meat of that excess sprue stub and start getting the shape back to where it should be with the scalpel. Thus. Likewise underneath. And then got my little pretty much worn out skinny stick, and I'm going to, yes I am on camera, run around that edge, evening out the curve and getting rid of the last little remnants of that attachment point. I keep gagging my finger on the flash on the back here, but we'll get to that in a moment. We're all the way around the top there. Sorting that out. That's got rid of the sprue stubs, or the joints, or whatever you want to call them. And then I use the same sanding stick and I just run around the entirety of the part on its edge to get rid of the flash that seems to attach itself to all these edges, or the sort of wobbliness in the mouldings that it always seems to be there. Just get rid of all of that, and then finally, just with the scalpel again, just a light scrape on the angle, and that just cleans the edge up further. If you only use the scalpel, you tend to chatter over all the bumps and irregularities, and it doesn't really clean it up properly. And because this is a kind of a visible area, what I would normally always do is just finish off with a sanding sponge, and because of the mould irregularities at the top here, I'm just going to come on to the front of the part a little bit, just to make sure they're not too glaringly obvious. And they are a bit, so I've trimmed them there. Just final one. There we go. And that's this part cleaned up. So I'm going to try not to get too overly frustrated throughout this, but this shows you, I think, I'm in the middle of the Blackbird build and it's been the same. Good design, it's a good design work, bad implementation. Should anybody have to spend the going rate on a brand new tool kit and then spend 5 minutes cleaning up one tiny part? My feeling is no. But let's carry on anyway. I'll clean the rest up and we'll get on. Here's our completed seat. Absolutely as it comes. With all that cleaning up, it did fit together reasonably well, though not perfect. As you can see, hopefully, there's a fairly prominent join or seam between the seat back and the seat base. It's just sitting itself right in the shade there where you can't really see it. And each inner side in here, please focus, thank you. Each inner side part of the seat features a delightfully prominent ejector pin circle, 2 of in fact, as you can see. So the joint's not perfect by any means in any of the areas, but that's it together. If ejector pin, I mean, if you went ahead and painted, weathered and washed the seat in the standard way, those ejector circles would be very prominent. So forewarned is forearmed. If these things bother you, these will want filling and sanding and smoothing off before they're fitted to the seat, because it will be very easy to do it then, as opposed to being really rather difficult to do it now. Moving on to this back plate, step 3 is to add presumably armour plate here and this smaller piece for the top part, and the top hole is not big enough for that pin to go through. So I'm going to whack this 1mm drill through it, hopefully that will allow the part to fit. 2 options with things like this: you can simply drill out the hole that is already there, or just cut the pin off the back of the part. You don't need the pin, you're going to glue it after all said and done. There you go, and now it fits. So top hole needs drilling out, or this uppermost pin needs removing. And to affix that permanently, I'll just add extra thin to each of these 3 pins, and it will soak through down through that hole and into the back of the part and hold it all on. We'll pop a bit on there as well, and that's that glued. Alright, I'm now on step 6, and this is part E39, and I think this is a pretty good illustration of some of the stuff you're up against with cleanup here. And in fairness, I think a lot of people would just leave well enough alone, but if I bring this part up close, I'm hoping that you can pick out all the little bits of sprue stubs that intrude onto that sort of tubular part, all the wobbly kind of ill-defined edges to everything. It's like a tiny little sort of mould seam slash sort of flash effect that makes all the edges to everything a bit wobbly. You can see this sort of focus, see the lump there just in front of that slot down here, and this sort of wobbly edge along the part. Yeah, it's all kind of clean upable, but it does take a lot of time and effort, and these these parts are quite flexible. They're quite, the moulding's quite sort of true to scale, I suppose, so they're relatively fragile, so care must be taken here. This part's all been cleaned up as best I can, without going nuts. As I say, it will take a while, and I wouldn't say it's impossible to do it all, but it's easy to miss things, is probably a better way of putting it. Note the panel here, and it's a very, very obvious ejector circle again, so clearly that will want fixing. It's in a very visible position, given that I think these are the throttle handles, so this lever is glued on to the front of it. and then this tube pipe part fits in here, and I had to lessen the depth of the mounting tab here. I realise that's probably focused on the background. I had to lessen the depth of this tab and thin it down to enable it to fit into position properly where it goes into the slot on this panel here. It's all good, continuing as expected in most ways, but yeah, a lot of cleanup for all of these parts to make them look good and to make them fit together properly so far. Right, step 10. Step 10 is fitting the floorboards into this cockpit assembly, and it is a bit of a faff. It's not hard to do. What's difficult is to figure out how you're supposed to do it. So here is the step 10 instruction, and it's not, I don't know if it's really all that clear, but the important part is this here. So if I just pop this back out again, you see we've got this central part and then the two L-shaped areas, and underneath each one of those has a lug. Now that lug sits into these two divots, but the central piece with the circle on it comes up through the middle of here. So the central piece comes up through the middle of here, and each the L-shaped pieces go out either side of it. So what the instructions are trying quite badly to show you is to post it up through here like so. Then those tabs can locate into the divots, and you just swing it upward, and at the back this large tab sits into the bottom here, and there it is from the bottom. So I'll hold it in place now. Just a touch of extra thin along there, give it a little press, and then the same up the front here. I've just used the tweezers to engage the tabs into those slots pretty much, and then we'll add some glue from the bottom again. And now when we push these back into place, they should just stay there because the glue's in there pretty much. There, lovely, lovely, lovely. And now you can see that's in place. So this is the majority of the cockpit framework actually built up. It's pretty impressive actually. So this is forwards. Yeah, I think it looks really fairly good. So if hopefully it's, there we go. So you can see there's quite a lot of included sort of knobs and dials and things, but everything's just very, very slightly soft. The moulding is just very slightly soft everywhere. Now it's tempting to say it's not very good, but I'm quite sure that a little bit of creative work with a paintbrush, that will look absolutely fine. But yeah, there's just a slight lack of sharpness about everything. It does fit together pretty well. There's a few parts that sort of interlock with each other and come together to form this, and it all does go together. It is a bit fiddly because you have to get sort of one end to tack up well enough with the glue while you push it, persuade everything else into place. But once it's all together, it's a relatively sturdy structure, and it works quite well. Do make sure when you're cleaning it up from the sprues, these joints here, these are sort of interlocking Z-shaped joints, both of them, and both of them had some quite advanced flash and stuff in the way, so if they hadn't been cleaned up, this would not be fitting together at all. So yeah, there you go. Not too bad at all, but let's continue. Well, I will continue. Got another, still got quite a few steps, but not too much in the way of parts, so I will crack on. Right, now the cockpit itself is essentially complete here, so I've added this sort of rear bulkhead part, and it sits up on the back of these moulded in angled plates on the sides. Each side has one, and it sort of sits into those. It's a little bit confusing when you're trying to fit it where it threads into down here. It's not obvious. It feels like it should be further forward than it is, but if you look here, it essentially just sort of butts up against this large circular part, and likewise on this side against the back of this lever here. So once that's in nice and solid, it all fits in nicely. Then the seat itself, it's got these sort of nuggets underneath which do slot together when you fit the seat together initially, but essentially the mounts on the back of it plug into here. So if you slot it down until those go into position, initially it all feels a bit not very secure, but keep on going and just wiggle those lower mounts into place so they fit in between pieces of detail that are already in there. And once it's in, if you look from the bottom, and I don't really know if that's going to come out because there's a lot going on here, but those nuggets I was talking about just slot onto these, again moulded on mounts on this piece of framework, and once it's in, even without glue, it's quite happy to sit there. I'm going to put glue on though, just post the old paint, the old extra thin into the positions, and it'll look its magic. Being honest, it's quite impressive the way it all slots together. There's quite a lot going on in here, lots of sort of structures and bits of tubes and all sorts going everywhere, and none of it makes a lot of sense truthfully until it all starts to go together, and then you think, oh yeah, oh I see where that goes now, and it all jumps into place nicely. We've got rudder pedals in at the front here, which sit in a hole in the very, very bottom part, and the other parts I've added this lever here and this piece of tubing which goes up to the engine, so that fits into the base plate along with the other piece of tubing that was fitted a minute ago. Post it in to this one, and then it just runs along the side and glues up at the front there. So the last parts of the puzzle are the actual instrument panel, and as you can see I've put the decal on just because I can. It would look a lot better if I had painted the panel first, clearly, because all those gaps around everything wouldn't show. It does go down over the detail reasonably well, but it does distort everything a little bit because some of the raised detail is quite heavily raised, and personally I don't really think that cuts it in 30-second scale, but I thought I'd put it on there just so that you can see how it looks. So we'll slot that in. Now note how these staggered mounting tabs just slot either side of the panels there. I'm holding it in position with light pressure each side, and I'll just, as ever, pop a little extra thin into there and then just gently make sure it's located, which it isn't. Not enough extra thin. I was a bit wary of it travelling down my thumbs, if I'm honest. There we go, that's better. That's on there now. Just like so. And the last part then is this cheeky little gun sight. It's a plastic part and a clear part all in one. There are two reflector options, a squared off one and a circular one. That posts through there, and again you've got a couple of locating pegs on the back of the instrument panel. This time I'll put glue in there first, but act to work reasonably quickly, and just put that into position on there, and then give it a little tweezer squeeze just to make sure it's actually seated and not just hovering. And again, square everything up, because obviously you saw that instrument panel, you probably didn't because I'm off camera again. Instrument panel moved as I did that, so I've just put everything back into place there, and that is the actual cockpit part of this done. Things I've noted: lots of cleanup, lots of mould seams, little ticks and corners of flash and chunks and general Revellisms, honestly. But with all the parts cleaned up, it actually does fit together really, really nicely. Really nicely. There are areas where I can see that it wouldn't if the parts weren't cleaned up adequately, and there are other areas, admittedly not super visible mostly, but when you get mould seams on circular parts, when you clean up those mould seams, you end up with oval parts rather than circular parts, and that was very, very obvious on the control column, the lever that goes back from it, so the elevator control rod, and a couple of other places. But with everything now together, it doesn't look too bad at all, and I think the detail is really, it's quite decent. Okay, welcome to the next day. My cockpit assembly there, it's now much stiffer as all the glue's dried. It's not got that kind of movement that it had last night, and the instrument panel decal has shrunk down beautifully over all that detail, but as I say, it does lead to a little bit of distortion, and it is really, really difficult to get all of the dials to line up correctly with it going over the detail, but that's all done. I also have the little pretend Merlin insert for where the exhaust go. This shaft is trapped between the insert and this representation of the front of the engine. I haven't glued it. I suspect it's meant to spin, but it's too tight within because of mould seams, which I did not clean off. But I don't need the propeller to spin, so I'm not bothered. If you do want the propeller to spin, you'll need to clean up that part a bit. This fuselage half has a small added lever to it. Note the ejector pin marks in highly visible areas. And on this one, we get a little piece of sidewall detail to fit on these pegs, and I just want to show you how that doesn't really fit there. So I put it on. Do you see how it's kind of, it's wobbly? You can't see very well. There you go. Clearly something in the way, and that something is the raised lip on this locating hole, and I've noticed that the majority of the locating holes so far, for some reason, have this raised lip on them. Don't know why. It's a little moulding irregularity, so I'll just trim that off. And also just a little lip on that ejector circle, and now hopefully this will sit down much more snugly when I find the location. Anyway, there you go. There, perfect. No movement at all. And with that in, and this is step 25 we're on now, I can start getting this fuselage together. Well, the fuselage tiles themselves, obviously I've taken them off the frames and I've cleaned up the sprue mounting points with the scalpel and with the sanding board. I noted that this joint here, all the way along, particularly on this half, had a tiny, in fact still a trace of it if you listen, a tiny lip on this outer edge, and that's due to the fact that the mould seam for this part runs right along this edge, which is fine, but the amount of lip that was there could potentially have interfered with the fit of the belly panel later, so that was trimmed off. This one didn't really have it. There's also a couple of moulding greeblies on these parts. So on this one, on the wing root fairing, right in this corner here, do you see that little lump there? That's a chunk out of the tool. It's not meant to be there. And this one has a similar thing going on just on this corner here. It kicks up. There's a big lump there, and yeah, it's not great, but that will need trimming off at some point. Anyway, let's stick these bits in. So this fake engine just locates onto the pegs there, and it does sit in position nicely. No big dramas with that at all. Put a reasonable amount of glue on that. Let it run around through and into all of that joint area, and just hold it lightly in place whilst it does so. One of the nice things about building with Tamiya extra thin type cement is that you don't have to hold things for very long. As long as you don't absolutely flood the joint with glue, it doesn't take too long to hold. So the cockpit itself then fits on these two small locating pegs which go in to the holes, one there and one there, and there is a lower one as well, sorry, that goes in there. Is fairly positive once you get it on, but it's quite difficult to see to locate it, but once it's in, it's fairly obvious that it's in. Damn it, was in. It doesn't have any ability to hold itself in position without glue, but there you can see how snug the fit at the back there is, and that all sits in there beautifully. So again, now that it's in place, I touch the extra thin to each point of contact and just hold it into position for a second. Guess we could talk about the weather in between times, right? It's quite nice here today. Touch it on that peg, hold it into position just for a few seconds, and then at the front I can see there's a little tab here that also butts up together inside. It's actually the front edge also of that cooling pipe that was added, but it's quite clear that it's meant to be like that. A little bit around that bulkhead. Okay. Now I've not got any glue on this front point, but it doesn't matter because it's glued here. And that is that in position. One last look. It is quite impressive, and I think were it painted up properly with a bit of seatbelt action from somewhere, would look really, really good. Especially when afforded the limited view that we'll get once it's sandwiched within these halves. So let's get these together then. It doesn't quite want to close up properly at the top here. I need to investigate whether that's something inside. You have to be careful when there's no bottom, because it's easy to just get it really wrong. But yes, I think we've got slightly too much width on the back of this bulkhead area here. There we go. Pushed it in a bit more, and it's now sitting together properly. So I'm going to use extra thin. I do normally build with super glue, as you know, but this being what it is, I think I'll just use extra thin for simplicity's sake. So I'm holding the joint together, not with a terrific amount of force, and I'm just going to relax it slightly and touch the brush to the model. Don't have too much glue on it. You don't want too much glue. You want enough to sort of visibly wet the surface, but not too much. And once it's in there, then squeeze the parts back together again. Now having that slight, relaxing that pressure very slightly like that, allows the glue to travel down the joint, where if you held it together tightly like it is now, the glue wouldn't really be able to travel through the joint properly. Or not as effectively anyway. And I'll keep holding this together until I can see that when I relax my pressure it doesn't spring back open, which will probably be a few minutes in this case. It's pretty much there. Now I've done no real preparation to this joint. I have trimmed off any really obvious little gnarly bits that were poking out. There were a couple of very small sort of little spikes, like tiny locating pins they looked like. I trimmed them off. They clearly weren't meant to be there. And I'm just going to work my way along this joint little bit by little bit. Adding the extra thin and letting it run into the joint and then pushing it together. Like so. Now with this having an open belly at this point, of course you could apply the cement from the underside, but the problem with doing that is that you can't see what you're doing at the top and whether or not you're making a good fist of this joint or not. Ooh. Okay. You can see back here at the leading edge of the fin that the central fuselage joint does not line up with the front of the fin. That's deliberate, it's on purpose, and it is correct. It's an offset fin. There's a sort of an angle to the fin on the real thing, and that is to counteract the natural torque effect and the prop wash from the engine and the propeller. Well, this is about as interesting as watching glue dry, so I'll continue in this vein and I'll come back to you when it's all together. Okay, fuselage is all together. If I come up close to this seam along the spine there, you can see it's a really good joint. No gaps anyway. Yes, it will need a little attention, but don't they always? You can see that I've got a little bit of sort of squeeze out of adhesive and plastic. That's all fine. Once that's fully cured, which is going to take at least overnight really, you can just knock that back with a Stanley stick and it'd be pretty much okay. Maybe with a touch of Mr. Surfacer or similar just to finish it off. The front here, same deal. There's a tiny sort of mismatch, but really nothing much. Again, just a tiny bit of sanding and filling. But do note, got a worsening of the texture towards the joints. I'm not sure if that will come up on the screen or not, but also this, I'm trying to get the light to reflect so that I can see what I'm trying to show you. This hatch here, surfacing hatch panel, same shape and size as the one here. Look how faint it is describing because of the fact that it's so close to this sort of more vertical area, so it can't be moulded properly. So I would recommend deepening that scribe or rescribing it, even make a template using this one before trying to address this seam here. So the next step in the instructions is to add the top cowl. That slots as a peg on the inside. It slots into here and just sits down. pretty decent again. It's not perfect, but it is decent. I've actually just flexed it a touch, just pushed it down in the middle and up at the sides because the shape is very slightly out of whack with the rest of the fuselage. But with that done, pushes down and sits quite flush, and that will glue into place nicely. And the next step from there is fitting the canopy. Obviously I wouldn't normally do that at this stage of a build, but I'm not painting this one, so I can. And it appears to fit into place really well. I'm going with the closed option, as you can see. It has this weird blunt front, but Hurricanes are like that. So that slots in at the front there, and it sticks up and looks weird, but that is how they are. So again, with attaching a canopy, I see so much stuff written and said about this kind of thing. Attaching canopies and how you mustn't use super glue and blah blah blah. You can use super glue if you want to. It shouldn't cause any fogging. The fogging is caused with super glue, at least, is caused by the fumes as the glue is curing, sort of attach themselves to the inside of the plastic, and it can be removed if you can get inside just by wiping. But if you don't use a lot, you should be fine. I'm going to use liquid extra thin in the same way that you would on anything else, but make sure that you've got no fingers nearby that can attract this capillary action and put the glue where you don't want it. And I'm just touching, I'm not using a lot, and I'm just touching to that joint and letting it flow in. You can tell with a clear part when it's flowed in sufficiently, because you can actually see a kind of difference in the appearance from it being wet. Let it lift a little, touch that in and push it back down. Front's not so bad because you've got a little bit of room before any clear part would be marred if you went wrong with the glue. And that's it, it's on. Do the same thing here. Just gently hold that in place. Got a bit too much glue on there. Just touch it on and let it flow. This has a small gap. I think it's to do with that slight shape mismatch. When it's pushed into place to fit properly in the middle, to be flush there, you end up with this sort of small gap at the side. It's not a massive issue, it could be quite easy to fix. And just FYI, I wouldn't use filler to do that. In this situation I would use Mr. Surfacer just in there, and once the surface has gone off, buff off the excess with a cotton bud which is moistened with Mr. Colour Thinner. Don't be sanding it and removing all that detail. There's no need. They don't fit perfectly on real aircraft, not even on new ones, so that should be fairly adequate like that. Getting into the wings then, and the first thing is to build the undercarriage bay, not surprisingly, and there's quite a few parts to this. The wing parts themselves, I've cleaned up all the sprue joints and everything else. Bits of flash around all these, getting the camera stupid, bits of flash around all these apertures as per, and I also found that here, where the sort of inside of the flap recess goes into the upper wing, it didn't sit very flush initially. It was sticking up a bit, so I've shaved down these ejector pins here. This one had a big lump around it and that was holding this a little proud, so I've shaved that down and it's a bit better now. It's not perfect, but it is a bit better. This side wasn't too bad, fits reasonably well. The other thing I did, and if you can see on this wing part, the trailing sort of edge part here gets a little thicker towards the end. I've also, on this one, trimmed it down. Ooh, come on camera. trimmed it down so it's the same thickness as the rest of the of that trailing edge, which also aids the fit. I need to do that yet on this one. Enough of that for the minute. Undercarriage bay. So firstly, this piece has these two side plates added to it, no issues there. Then this clear part, so the clear part is there because these two sections here, I really must get under the camera, these two sections here are actually supposed to be windows, so on a real build you would want to mask those about now. And when you fit that to this, then the instructions, I feel, it's not 100% clear where that's supposed to fit, and it took a bit of working out, because the obvious assumption would be that it fits on top, but it just doesn't look right. And this is a little bit, you can see it's a little bit warped, a bit bent. What it actually has to do is go underneath these ledges, and I just stretch it over. You can, because of that flexibility, flex it over, but you can see there where it's joined, you can see how it's bent. So I will glue one edge first and then just push the other one into position. But once it is in position, it does seem to fit quite well. Right, I'm back with the very next stage in the instructions, that being stage 31. And if you look at the diagram here, particularly at part number G100, which is the one that I have fitted, I'm not sure if it's just me, and I can kind of see how it is meant to fit together now, having fitted one of them, but that diagram really doesn't really work for me. So the part itself, when you look at it and when you look at where it has to go, it kind of looks as though it's supposed to fit this way, because the shelf it sits in is the same width as this is. However, it doesn't. It actually fits vertically and forms a kind of a wall at the back there, and then the piece, the tube or the rod that's going up, sits into that V, this side panel. So yeah, not particularly obvious to me anyway. It could be a failing with me, I accept that completely, but I found that it took me a few moments of jiggering around before that made any sense. Also, the front part of the wheel bay, part of the wing spar arrangement, slots onto the front of these two parts. Make sure you clean all of the flash and the nonsense off the front of these two parts. They were both very lumpy, scratchy, just horribly finished. If that's not properly cleaned up, then this won't fit snugly. Make sure the pipe's going through that hole. Yeah? Now, what's confusing me at this point is that if I bring it together at the end, as it should be, it induces a curve into that forward beam. Not much of one, granted, but a curve nonetheless. I'm fairly convinced it's not meant to have one, but I think once sort of glued into the part of the wing it has to go into, it should hold it straightish, but just be a bit careful of that as well. On a side note, I meant to mention it before when looking at the cockpit parts, but this is something, it's not just Revell that do this, but it really irritates me. And yes, I know it's a first world problem, but it is something that doesn't need to be a problem. So this is sprue G, and if I'm looking for part 104, 105, which are the gas bottles, I can see them straight away because they're gas bottles, but where's the order in these part numbers? Look up here, for instance, where my hand is. You've got part 70 next to part 28, which is next to part 83, which is above part 14. What the heck is that about? If these were sequentially numbered, it would make it so much easier to find the parts, especially on sort of closely packed sprues like this, where a lot of the parts, it's not really obvious where they go or what they're for. It just really annoys me. Well, welcome back to tomorrow again. I had to stop filming yesterday because of general noise around the house. And I stopped at the point where the undercarriage bay was just built. So what I did since since the last bit I shot was I glued this. I've left the ends free. It is sitting a lot better with glue, to be fair, but I didn't want to sort of stretch this into place just in case, and at that point I decided to start doing some test fitting just to satisfy myself that everything was going to work, with that slight concern of the bowed sort of spar area, because, you know, generally speaking, you wouldn't expect any kind of wing spar to have a bend in it. It just doesn't make sense, unless it was required by the design of the wing, of course. Anyway, the wing in this kit is kind of odd. You got this part, and then you got the front of this part, and because of the wheel bay they don't physically attach together. So in order to check this fit, I was just going to use these two parts, but obviously I cannot because of that. Just get that in place like so. It's got little pegs that locate it, and it sits quite nicely. Looks good, but I cannot really check this very well, because although it does sit on that when glued, it can't really sit there. So I thought, well, I'm going to have to put the rest of the wing together. And I don't know if you recall during the part where I looked at the sprues that I thought that this peg and tab arrangement might be a bit tricksy. They quite often are, these kind of things, a little bit awkward. So I decided to put the rest of the wing together and see what was happening. I started with the right hand side, that's this one. I was having all sorts of trouble because you have to angle it up like this, because you've already glued this piece of spar in place as per the instructions. It has to be angled up to allow all of the tabs to come over and then lock onto their respective pins. And I was having all sorts of problems getting this one to go on. So it was so tight, I had to flex it quite strongly to get it in. And taking it off again in order to shoot this section, I actually pulled off the pin with it for this tab here. It's not a problem, it will still sit there, but I pulled it off in the act of removing the wing. But I don't know if you can see, as this starts to come into place, the front isn't lining up at all. You have to make sure that the wing is under the edge of this rear part of the wheel bay, otherwise it doesn't want to line up. And even though it's in place now, it just didn't want to line up, and I don't know what I was doing wrong, but I used more force and on it popped. I did in fact reassure myself by fitting the left hand one at one point that I wasn't doing it wildly wrong, because it just didn't look like it wanted to line up at all. And the left one, in fairness, just popped straight in place like it just did now. You've just seen that live action. I've not fettled or messed with these parts in any way, apart from fastidiously cleaning up mould seams on the edge of this centre section. And if we just flip it over, and you can see it's quite, even without glue, these are quite happily sitting in place now. If I just flip it over for you, the join is fabulous. I genuinely wouldn't bother filling that myself. Maybe a little bit of Mr. Surfacer just to remove this sort of appearance of a gap, but there's not really a gap there, it's just a sort of a deep panel line in effect. I think that's quite lovely and commendable, actually. It's a very good job. So further from there then, if I pop this wheel bay back into place on the centre section, thus, and I can now offer up this piece, and it locks into the two tabs here and here, and it all just fits together beautifully. So I did get a warning on my Facebook page that this was tricky. I've had a couple of messages from people saying they were not happy with some of the areas of fit on the kit, but yeah, there's really nothing wrong with that. I don't know really what to say beyond the fact that I have not, this isn't a special kit, this is straight off the shelf at a shop. I've not done anything. I think, and I mean no offence to anybody, I think the key to success with this kit is parts prep. I think if you don't prepare the parts properly, that's a mouthful, you are going to run into problems and fit issues. But if the parts are prepared properly. I haven't had anything that really doesn't fit yet. However, fast forward a bit. So, having said that, I thought at this point it might be clever to fit the rest of the wing together and see how everything looks with regard to fitting the wing to the fuselage, because obviously that's pretty much the next step anyway, once the wing's together. So going back to quick snip technology and taping this together, bear with me. Alright, we now have a complete main wing, so let's see if that fits the fuselage. You can see for fitting we've got these two little loops, one either side, and they engage on these little tabs here, and there's also a sort of shelf just there for it to sit on, which is part of a locating peg at this back trailing edge. It's very obvious how it sits in because this step in the internals lines up with this secondary spar here. And that's what we end up with. So I'm not going to lie, this isn't stellar, especially on this side. And the issue seems to stem from this area of wing root that's been moulded into the fuselage halves. They just don't really line up. And as well as that, I don't know if it's obvious, actually it is. You see this, where it swoops downwards and isn't lining up. It's lining up at the back and in the middle, but not here. And that's where that tab is. So clearly the aperture in the tab isn't quite big enough for that peg to go into. See the peg? So I think what I'm going to do probably is work on these upper wings and actually attach them to the fuselage and then bring the rest of the wing to it in the way that Airfix very often do with their kits these days, so that I can make sure that this joint, which is the one that you can really see after all said and done, is as good as it can be. And I'm going to get on with performing that work now. So here I've successfully trimmed and fitted this upper wing. Essentially just had to trim material from here and straighten this a little. It doesn't matter whether you take material off this part or this part, but basically needed to lose probably 1/4 of a mil or so there. And once that was done, it fits quite nicely. You might be able to make out what appears to be a gap here, but if you look carefully, you can see that as it's moulded, there is a sort of a step there in the panels. So there's always going to be a slight difference in the fit just there, no matter what you do, unless you choose to take that step out of the panels, which I did not. And again, although along the top of this joint it appears a touch gappy, and it certainly isn't much, if you look at the inside, it's fitted tightly and neatly. And I have simply glued that into position from the top just by running a little extra thin down there in the normal way, and it fits really nicely now. And I've done the same thing with this side. This side was a bit more tricky, as I had to take material, and it was fairly obvious when I showed the fit before, but I had to take material from this notch area. So I've taken some off this edge, deepened the notch, and actually some off here as well, using a combination of scalpel and sanding board, and at the same time neatened up this side of the joint also, so that now I've got a good fit. It'll look better with glue, trust me. got a good enough fit throughout that we're not looking at large amounts of filling and sanding, and that's what we want. We don't want to have to be doing lots of filling and sanding when there's a good amount of raised detail on this area here, and we don't want to lose it. Any worries about whether this would now fit to the lower wing? I have test fitted this side, and I'll just show you how that pans out. Pops on with no bother. Yes, there's a mismatch, but with the magic of glue and a tiny bit of pressure, that goes together wonderfully. So to show how to glue it, it's a bit awkward because I've only got 2 hands like most humans. You have to be a little bit patient. You can't expect to glue the whole thing in one go and have it all go swimmingly. So I just applied a little extra thin around the back, and then hold everything into position and hold the height up where you want it, and just pull everything into place and give that a few moments. It's not going to set up hard, but it will hold it enough that you can then move along and add some glue into the other areas. See, I've gone straight for the front just to anchor it effectively. There we go, and it's now sort of holding itself in position. I am supporting it from underneath, but it's holding itself in position enough to allow addition of the cement along the entirety of the joint. Don't put too much in. If you put too much in, it takes longer to set up and it melts everything a bit too much. You don't want a load of material squeezing out on this because it'll be much more difficult to clean it back up again. There, now while it's not quite gone off, this is when you can just check, make sure everything's lined up, and just manipulate everything gently to get that joint as good as you can. And then what we'll do is flip everything over and apply cement from underneath as well. Make sure the joint is fully wetted out, I suppose, with cement. There we go. And then you just have to sit and hold it just for long enough for it to be safe to be set down, because if you're not careful, as you probably saw there where I put extra glue in the bottom, it softened everything enough that moved, and if you go ahead and just set this down straight away, it could easily droop or sag into a position you don't want it in, and then set like that, which is, yeah, we don't want that. So the wing is all successfully attached, buttoned up and glued, and for my money at least, it's gone together pretty well. At the back here, in this sort of area which would be covered by the flaps if you fit them retracted, I chucked some glue in and then held it all together tightly with one of these clamps, and everywhere else I just worked my way along and used tape to help hold it in position. All of these inserts are a little bit hit and miss. They're not terrible. I want to stress that they're not terrible, but none of them are what you might call excellent. This clear part has got quite a long gap, quite a large gap towards the sides, which is hard to see because it's clear, and this one's kind of pretty much the same. You see the gaps in the ends of things. They're not stellar, but relatively straightforward to clean up around those, because there's not tons and tons of good detail next to them, with the exception probably of this area here. The wingtip nav lights fitted quite nicely, they're not too bad at all. So with that all done, we turn our attention to the belly, and I wanted to point out a couple of things here. So you've got a separate lower cowl which butts into place at the back there under the wing, and it initially looks okay, but when you can look closely you can see that kind of step towards that rear edge, which makes it look on first glance as though this cowl area is too narrow, but it is not. I believe it's actually the fault of this part. As if you look closely, can you see that sort of step at the back edge where it almost looks as though the mould is over, the part is overfilled. I'm just going to sand and carve these two back corners a little thinner to make that fit. Then this, waits for camera, this belly part here, it has a peg at the front which locates here, and then these two tabs are again forming a shelf for it to sit on, and that presses into place quite happily. Now I would suggest when you glue this on that you start by locating this area firmly and use the clamps. Let me grab a couple. Use the clamps to hold it in place like this. Get the glue in there and let it set before moving on, like that. And then when you come to positioning and locating the rest of it, it does drop into place quite nicely, thank you. It's one of those sort of mitre joint arrangements, so it can be persuaded to form a really lovely joint which will require very minimal cleanup. At the back here though is a good example, or two actually, of how locating pegs and things can sometimes work against us, because at the back here the locations are slightly out of whack. You can see those pegs just in the gap, they don't quite nicely meet up in there, and then when you push that in it forces the middle out, slightly the wrong length. Likewise, this very last piece has got two pegs which go into these holes, and on its own it will sit beautifully in there, but you get a nasty shelf here which is caused by the fact that the thickness isn't quite right here. So I would suggest cutting these tabs off completely and actually just dropping this part in by itself at the back here once everything else is solid. And just to show you what I've done, so this is that cowl part, and on this half I've trimmed it and carved it and sanded it back and removed what that sort of shelf looking arrangement at the back there where it appeared as though it had two levels, and look at the difference in comparison to how it looked before, which was essentially like that. It's taken away that extra thickness that appears to be there, has basically completely fixed that joint, and it doesn't really need any further work from here. At the back I ran the sanding board along this front edge here like so, because it was a tiny bit tight, and in this area here on the kit itself, on the rest of the fuselage, where the joint transitions from sort of the wing root area but into the fuselage proper, was a little bit softly moulded, and that was causing some interference as well. And then at the back here I've removed those shelves and taken some thickness off the front two locating pegs, and now the front just drops into place, and then so just the rest of it, virtually no pressure, and there's a lovely joint all the way down. Likewise this back end piece drops into place, and look how much less of a joint there is there, even without glue, even without holding it in place. So as modellers we can complain and say kits are bad and manufacturers are rubbish, or we can learn how to sort these issues out and make things right for ourselves. Well, we're closing in on a completed model here. I have added the back end, as you can see. Elevators are separate so you can pose them should you desire, and I do really like the way the hinge mechanisms are portrayed actually on this kit. Really nice, really nicely done. There's a very, no, I think it's not really fair to call that a gap. I think the tail planes fit very well, and they've got that interlocking finger thing going on, so when you put them in they lock together, and it helps keep everything straight. Added the final part of the nose. The kit supplies 2 versions of this. Well, this one is in 2 parts, and it's got the sort of the oil splash ring attachment on it. This one does not, but as you can see, that's popped into place without any undue bother. And then the propeller assembly, here it is, all cleaned up. There were a lot of quite heavy mould seams on the propeller blades, especially around the sort of cuff area at the bottom here, which needed some fairly substantial clean up. But once cleaned up it looks okay. It's probably a little bit thick on the trailing edge, but it's quite a nice unit. I did have to increase the size of the hole there slightly for it to fit nicely on the propeller shaft. It did fit before, but it needed a really firm push, so I think it would have broken taking it off again. Ailerons, again separate and mounted in a very, very prototypical manner. Really nice to see. Only thing I would say with these is they do have quite thick trailing edges, which I don't like. Probably they do match the wing, I suppose, but they're a little bit thick to my taste. The best way to fix that generally is to sand the insides thinner before you put them together, because that way you don't lose that fabric effect. And all of that done, that pushes us on to the smaller parts. So the first of which was the tail wheel assembly. There it is. This is 2 halves to make the actual unit and 2 halves for the tyre. The tyre is trapped in between the 2, so it does rotate. And I did have to carve down the mounting spigot on this quite substantially to get it in, and it's still tight, so I didn't actually pull it back out again. Also note, I don't know why I'm holding it upside down, the sort of aft face of this sort of ventral strake here had to be cut to this angle. Instructions detail it as 2mm. It was vertical following this panel line. So that was cut to the angle, and clearly if you don't do that, the tail wheel assembly isn't going to fit, so that does need to be done. So yeah, that brings us on to the undercarriage. So the undercarriage is made up of, let's put this over here out of the way, smash it into everything. You've got a main leg, a brace, your undercarriage door, which is in 3 separate parts, 2 halves of wheel and tyre, and then a separate wheel hub. And all of that, when it's cleaned up, there's some fairly advanced mould seam lines on. All the parts need a good deal of clean up, just like everything else in the kit, but when cleaned up and put together, this is what you're left with, which actually looks quite good, I think. And then the wheel has a sort of a slight shape in there which locates it. I don't see any real reason for that because there's no flattened area, but that's it fitted. And I did test my assembly because it's not strictly by the instructions, but this assembly as is here will slip into place perfectly happily, as you can see, into the kit. And once it is located, it's quite sturdily located, and then the brace will fit in by itself afterward. Alright, last few bits going on now. The exhausts, they plug in beautifully, really nice solid locations for those. They're in 2 halves, so there is a seam down the middle of them, but they're not too bad. They're quite a nice shape, but they're not hollowed out or anything like that. Undercarriage is in, and as soon as you get glue on it, it's really quite sturdy straight away. I'm not super convinced by the angle of the tyres, but it doesn't seem to want to sit any other way. And then I've got a couple of small bits left still. Step, pitot and the aerial, 2 ident lamps. So there's one that fits up here behind the aerial, But there's also one that fits on the trailing edge of the rudder, and that one is not mentioned in the instructions anywhere, but it is on the sprues, and it's part number J69. So don't forget to stick that on when you build yours. And the last point really I want to mention before wrapping up is the flaps. So you get a choice of deployed flaps or raised flaps. I have already fitted one lowered flap just because it looks more interesting. There you go. And just to prove that the raised ones work, I just snipped off the locating tabs, because truthfully I don't really see the point since it's going to be glued flat anyway. And there you go. Sits in there perfectly well, to be honest. But what I wanted to point out was just the level of cleanup required on these parts. Yet again, it's so huge, great sprue stubs everywhere. There's a big mould seam that forms a corner up on that leading edge there, and the big the big sprue pegs intrude onto the outer surface of the part as well. It's a real, I think it literally took about 10 minutes to clean the other one up, along with the flash and the mould seams off of these mounting pegs to actually allow them to slip into place as well. Yeah, I would also recommend, I didn't do it because I didn't think ahead, but where the actual mounting slots are in the wing there, probably worth just clearing them out a little bit before putting the wing parts together, because this one in particular on the other side was a bit small and I had to sort of try and poke it out with this. But it has gone in now. That isn't even glued and it's super firm, really nicely in place, so it's all good in the end. And with that I'll just put these last few parts on and then we'll do a wrap up. Right then, here it is, all built and naked. The Revell 32nd scale Hurricane IIB. So what do we think overall? Well, before we get into that, let's have a quick look at the sprues and see what parts are left over, because that'll give clues to people as to upcoming versions and indeed whether or not you can use this kit to build other versions. So I'll move this out of the way. First off, on the clear sprue, the only thing that's left is the open option canopy. Obviously I went for the closed one for simplicity. There's that separate nose with the oil catch ring. On sprue I, there are the 4 cannon barrels, but there are no leading edge inserts in which to fit those. And I don't know if I'm just completely dreaming, but I think the cannon version might have some bumps on the wings as well. Sprue E has the other option of exhaust, the 2 halves for each side, and this is the circular outlet style of exhaust stub. Sprue F has the Sea Hurricane lower fuselage insert. And most of the remaining parts are actually on sprue G, and those parts are the arrestor hook to go with that lower fuselage insert, 2 funny little pulley looking things, I don't know what they are for, but they might be something to do with the Sea Hurricane, the retracted boarding step, a different style of head armour for the cockpit, that is the hook for the A-frame arrestor, tropical air intake. The back part of it is somewhere, I'm not sure where, but there is a full tropical air intake included in this kit. So that's the 2 front halves, and there is an element that sits inside that too. And finally a circular part which is potentially a headrest, and this here being the gun camera. So that's just there for info. Those that know a lot more about Hurricanes than me can figure out what they need from that. The decals I'm not going to fit. I don't think there'd be any value to you, the modeller, if I were to fit decals to an unpainted plastic surface, because it simply isn't representative. However, judging by how well the instrument panel decal conformed to the detail on that, I'd say these will work absolutely fine. I used Tamiya Mr. Mark Fit Strong as a setting agent, and I used the Ultimate Strong setting solution to melt that decal to get it to conform. I would say that on the outward surface of the model that this strength of solution is probably not required, because they did soften quite easily. So then, the model itself, I think it looks glorious. There were multiple suggestions on the internet when initial photographs were released that the dihedral looked a bit whack, and I can't disagree, it did look odd in those photos, but I do not think that it looks odd on my finished kit at all. It looks lovely. It looked every inch the Hurricane, and I'm actually slightly disappointed that I didn't build it properly, having said that I didn't want a Hurricane 2B. But hey ho. Construction wise, I'm just going to hold it up so you can see the dihedral best I can with my limited range. Hopefully, if you've watched this video through, you can see there are no major fit issues on this kit. There is nothing here which, well, the fit issues that did present themselves were resolved simply by preparing the parts. The only exception to that is this upper wing joint area at the front here, where the fairing parts that were moulded into the fuselage were just a little too long and weren't allowing the upper wing to fit properly on both sides. But as I showed you, and as you can see, that was resolved with a little trimming. And the only other one is these leading edge inserts. None of them are fantastic. They're all quite gappy around the ends, as you can see there. This one's got a big gap on the underside. That isn't anything I've done. I didn't trim these holes out, these apertures out. That's how they were, and there's no easy way of sorting that without using filler. You could maybe use plastic card strips and jiggery pokery, but truthfully, this is half an hour's work with super glue and talc filler to sort it out, so it's nothing to write home about, really. I think the detail is not exceptional, but it is certainly very adequate. It's up to speed, really. The surface detail is very nice. There's lots of different sorts of fasteners represented. You don't have full riveting on the wing surfaces, but you do have various bits of fastener detail. The Zeus fasteners actually look like Zeus fasteners for a change. And I do like the fabric representation. Other people's mileage may vary on that, but I personally think it's just about right. And for the price, around about the £40 mark, I really don't think there's any room to complain about the levels of detail that are included here. Maybe a touch of photo etch for a new instrument panel and a set of seat belts in here. Some resin exhaust with open ends, some resin wheels. You're laughing. I think that's all it really needs. So overall, the mantra with this kit has got to be preparation, preparation, preparation. Prepare the parts. I've tried to show you how and where that needs to be done, but essentially every single part of this kit needed preparation. All those mould seams need to be removed. All the flash, all the sprue stubs that are difficult and big and awkward. Be wary of ejector pin marks with the flash around the edges holding your parts apart. And virtually every single location peg, the reciprocating hole for that had a raised ring of sort of excess material around it, which was preventing a good fit in a lot of areas. So with all that parts prep done, as you can see, this thing fits together beautifully. Whether or not you should feel it reasonable for the modeller to have to do that much work on a modern new tool mainstream injection kit is up to you, but I think for the price Revell are asking, it's somewhat acceptable, and I would happily build another one with some paint on it, so when they do release the 2C, I more than likely will get one. So that's my take on it. I hope, and I know this is a long video, I know that. I didn't want to release it in 2 parts because I felt it would lose some of the impact if I did that. So apologies for the length of it, but I genuinely think this will be useful for anybody who's contemplating buying this kit, or indeed anyone who's actually building it, just to see where the pitfalls are and hopefully suggest some sensible solutions to them. So I welcome feedback. I don't think this Bare Naked build series is going to be a regular one, because technically it's pretty much a waste of a good kit, but for these slightly larger and more complex subjects, I think it's potentially useful. So yeah, let me know what you think in the comments. Anyone, as ever, who wants to support the channel could do so with the Buy Me a Coffee app, which is also linked below. Thanks very much to those who already have done so and continue to do so. Thanks to everyone for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it, and with that said, it only remains for me to say, look after yourselves, look after each other. Genesis out.